The Meridian's grace died the way most ships die, not with a single dramatic explosion, but with a series of smaller failures that cascaded through her systems like dominoes falling in slow motion. Elias Crowe felt the first impact while he was elbow-deep in a coolant manifold on Deck 17, cursing at a gasket that refused to seat properly. The ship shuddered, and for a moment he thought one of the junior engineers had finally managed to blow up the secondary reactor like he had been warning them about for weeks. Then the second impact came, and the third, and the lights went out, and Elias understood that something far worse than incompetence was happening. He pulled his arms free from the manifold and grabbed the emergency torch clipped to his belt, clicking it on just as the backup lighting flickered to life in dull red strips along the corridor walls. The ship groaned around him, metal stressed beyond its tolerances, and somewhere in the distance he heard the unmistakable sound of atmosphere venting into space. That particular whistle had haunted his nightmares since basic training. He had hoped never to hear it outside of simulations. The intercom crackled with partial messages, words cut off mid-sentence, orders that ended in static. Elias caught fragments about hull breaches and enemy contact and evacuation protocols, none of it forming a coherent picture. He started moving anyway, because standing still in a dying ship was a good way to become part of the debris. His quarters were 4 decks up and half the ship away, but he had no intention of going there. Everything he truly cared about was already on his person or existed only in his memory. Instead, he headed toward the main hangar deck, driven by the simple logic that escape pods were small and fragile, while shuttles were slightly less small and slightly less fragile. The corridors were chaos. Crew members ran past him in both directions, some carrying equipment, others carrying nothing but fear. Elias pressed himself against the wall to let a damage control team sprint by, their faces grim beneath their helmets. He recognized one of them, a woman named Chen who owed him 40 credits from a card game 3 weeks ago. He considered reminding her, but decided that debt collection during a catastrophic attack might be considered poor form. The ship lurched again, and Elias grabbed a support strut to keep from falling. Through a viewport he caught his first glimpse of what was happening outside, and the sight made his stomach clench. The battle had already ended, or at least this phase of it had. The Meridian's grace drifted through a field of wreckage so dense that Elias could barely see the stars beyond. Terran ships floated dead alongside Kaeleth vessels, their hulls torn open, their running lights dark. Bodies drifted among the debris, too distant to identify but close enough to imagine. The scale of destruction was beyond anything Elias had witnessed in his 6 years of service. Whatever had happened here, both sides had lost. He kept moving. The main lifts were offline, naturally, so he took the emergency ladders between decks, climbing with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this drill 100 times but never quite believed it would matter. His shoulders ached by the 3rd deck, his lungs burned by the 5th. He was an engineer, not an athlete, and his body was making its displeasure known in increasingly creative ways. When he finally reached the hangar level, he paused to catch his breath and promised himself that if he survived this, he would actually use the ship's gymnasium instead of just walking, past it with vague intentions. The hangar deck was worse than the corridors. The main lights had failed completely here, leaving only the red emergency strips and the occasional spark shower from damaged conduits. Fighters lay scattered across the deck like discarded toys, some merely damaged, others reduced to unrecognizable wreckage. A cargo loader had toppled onto its side and was leaking hydraulic fluid in a spreading pool that reflected the emergency lights like dark blood. The bay doors at the far end of the hangar stood open to space, held back only by the shimmering barrier of an emergency force field that Elias did not entirely trust. Beyond that barrier, the debris field stretched into infinity, a cemetery of metal and ambition. Elias picked his way through the wreckage, checking each shuttle and escape pod he passed. The first 3 were damaged beyond use. The 4th had already launched, its cradle empty. The fifth was intact but locked, and when he tried to override the security panel, he discovered that the authorization codes had been changed sometime in the last week, probably by some officer who wanted to reserve the shuttle for himself. Elias made a mental note to find that officer and express his displeasure, assuming either of them lived long enough for such expressions. He was approaching the sixth shuttle when he saw her. At first his mind refused to process what he was looking at. The shape propped against the support column did not fit any category his brain was prepared to accept. Then the shape moved, just slightly, and Elias understood that he was looking at a Kaeleth soldier, wounded and stranded in the hangar of an enemy vessel. He should have run. He should have called for security, or at least found a weapon before approaching. The Kaeleth were the enemy, had been the enemy for 3 years, and everything he knew about them came from combat briefings that emphasized their danger and their otherness. But something held him in place, a curiosity he could not explain, a sense that running away from a wounded creature was not the kind of person he wanted to be, even if that creature belonged to a species currently trying to kill his own. Elias approached slowly, his hands visible, the universal gesture of someone who meant no immediate harm. The Kaeleth watched him come, her eyes tracking his movement with an intensity that made him want to reconsider his choices. She was not what he expected. The briefings had described the Kaeleth as alien, inhuman, a threat to be neutralized rather than understood. They had not mentioned that Kaeleth women looked remarkably like human women, save for the ears that swept upward in elegant points and the skin that held a blue tint like the edge of twilight. They had not mentioned the way the faint luminescence beneath that skin pulsed gently with each breath, as if she carried starlight in her veins. Her armor was damaged, cracked along the left side where something had struck her with tremendous force. Blood seeped from beneath the broken plates, darker than human blood but recognizable enough. Her hair was yellow like honey, like autumn leaves, braided in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be merely decorative. She held no weapon that Elias could see, though he suspected that a Kaeleth warrior was dangerous enough without one. He stopped 3 meters away, close enough to see the pain in her amber eyes but far enough to run if she lunged at him. Not that running would help much in the enclosed space of the hangar, but the illusion of options was sometimes comforting. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, two representatives of warring species, alone in the wreckage of a battle that had consumed them both. Then Elias did something that surprised him more than anything else that had happened since the first impact shook the ship. He knelt down, opened his tool kit, and began to assess the damage to her armor, as if she were just another broken machine waiting to be repaired. The armor was alive. That was the only conclusion Elias could reach as he examined the damaged plates covering the Kaeleth woman's torso. The material responded to his touch, contracting slightly when his fingers brushed against it, warming beneath his palm as if recognizing the presence of something foreign. He had worked with adaptive composites before, smart materials that adjusted their properties based on environmental conditions, but nothing in Terran engineering came close to this. The armor was not merely worn by its wearer. It was bonded to her, integrated with her biology in ways that made his engineering training feel like a child playing with blocks. He sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath. The Kaeleth woman watched him with those amber eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim emergency lighting. She had not spoken since he approached, had not moved except to track his movements with her gaze. Elias wondered if she was conserving her strength or simply deciding whether to kill him once she recovered enough to try. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Elias had never been comfortable with silence. It reminded him too much of the empty quarters he returned to each night, the absence of voices that had once filled spaces now abandoned. He cleared his throat and gestured toward her damaged side. "That looks painful," he said, knowing she could not understand him but needing to fill the void with something. "I assume it's painful. Maybe your species doesn't feel pain." Maybe you experience damage as a mild tingling sensation accompanied by pleasant memories of your childhood. Wouldn't that be nice? I stub my toe, and suddenly I'm reliving my 8th birthday party. Although my 8th birthday party was terrible, so maybe not. She tilted her head slightly, the movement almost bird-like. Her ears, those long, elegant points that swept upward from the sides of her head, shifted with the motion in a way that seemed expressive. Elias wondered if Kaeleth's ears were like human eyebrows, capable of conveying emotion through subtle changes in position. He filed the observation away for later consideration, assuming there was a later to consider anything. He turned his attention back to the armor. The damaged section had cracked along stress lines that followed the contours of her ribs, and through the gaps he could see the material beneath, a layer that seemed organic rather than mechanical. Blood had pooled in the crevices, dark and thick, and the surrounding tissue pulsed with that faint interior light he had noticed before. Removing the armor would require understanding how it connected to her body, and understanding that connection would require either extensive study or extraordinary luck. Elias had never been particularly lucky, but he was stubborn enough to compensate. He pulled a diagnostic scanner from his tool kit and passed it over the damaged area. The device chirped unhappily, displaying readings it clearly did not know how to interpret. Elias had expected as much. Terran technology was designed to analyze Terran materials, not alien biotechnology that seemed to exist in some uncomfortable space between machine and organism. He would have to work with his hands and his instincts, the old ways of engineering that predated computers and sensors and the comfortable certainty of data. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to his silent patient. "Let's see what we're dealing with." He began with the edges of the damaged section, probing gently with his fingers to understand where the armor ended and her body began. The transition was disturbingly gradual. The outer plates gave way to a flexible underlayer that seemed to merge with her skin rather than rest upon it. Beneath that, he could feel the movement of muscles, the expansion of lungs, the steady rhythm of a heart that beat slightly faster than a human heart would. She was warm beneath his touch, warmer than he expected, and that warmth reminded him that he was not working on a machine at all, but on a living being who had every reason to consider him an enemy. The Kaeleth woman made a sound, low and musical, somewhere between a hum and a word. Elias paused and looked up at her face. She was watching his hands with an expression he could not read, though he thought he detected something like curiosity beneath the pain. When she spoke again, the sounds were clearly language, structured and intentional, but they meant nothing to his untrained ears. The ship's translation software might help, if he could find a working terminal, and if the software had any Kaeleth language files loaded. Both seemed unlikely given the current state of the vessel. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head slowly. "But I'm going to take that as encouragement rather than a death threat, positive thinking and all that." He returned to his examination. The armor's damage was severe but localized, concentrated on one section that had taken the brunt of whatever impact had wounded her. If he could remove that section without disturbing the rest, he might be able to assess her injuries directly and determine whether anything could be done. The question was how to separate a piece of armor that seemed to be part of her body without causing further harm. Elias noticed a pattern in the way the plates overlapped, a sequence that reminded him of the interlocking scales of certain Terran fish. He traced the pattern with his finger, following it around the edge of the damaged area until he found what he was looking for. A seam almost invisible where one plate slid beneath another. He pressed gently and the plate shifted just slightly as if acknowledging his understanding. "There we go," he whispered. "Everything has a mechanism. Everything can be taken apart if you know where to look." He worked slowly, methodically, sliding each plate aside to reveal the layer beneath. The Kaeleth woman remained still throughout, though he heard her breath catch once when his movements jostled the damaged tissue. Her hands, which had been resting at her sides, curled into fists briefly before relaxing again. She was enduring, Elias realized, accepting the pain because she understood that he was trying to help, or perhaps simply because she had no strength left to resist. The innermost layer of armor was different from the outer plates, softer and more organic, threaded through with filaments that glowed the same faint blue as the light beneath her skin. When Elias touched these filaments, the woman gasped and grabbed his wrist with sudden strength. Her grip was firm but not aggressive, and when he looked at her face, he saw not anger but something closer to surprise. She spoke rapidly, the words tumbling over each other, and though he still could not understand the meaning, the tone was clear enough. He had touched something sensitive, something important, something that perhaps should not be touched by outsiders. "Sorry," he said, pulling his hand back carefully. "I didn't know. I'll be more careful." She held his gaze for a long moment, then released his wrist and nodded slowly. The gesture was familiar, universal in a way that transcended species. She was trusting him, or at least choosing to extend the possibility of trust. Given the circumstances, Elias supposed that was as much as either of them could offer. He noticed the shrine for the first time when he glanced away from her face. It occupied a small alcove set into the hangar wall, perhaps 3 meters from where the Kaeleth woman rested. Someone had arranged objects there, small items he did not recognize, surrounding a vessel from which thin smoke rose in curling patterns. The smoke carried a scent that filled the immediate area, something between cedar and ozone, like a forest after a lightning storm. He had smelled it since entering this section of the hangar but had not identified its source until now. "You built that," he said, looking back at her, "which means you've been here for a while, not just from the battle. You were on this ship before everything fell apart." She followed his gaze to the shrine, and something changed in her expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of the tension in her jaw. Whatever that collection of objects represented, it meant something to her. Elias filed that observation alongside his notes about her ears and her armor, building a picture of a person rather than an enemy. The translation software took 3 hours to patch together from salvaged components, and even then it worked only intermittently, rendering every third sentence as garbled nonsense or ominous silence. Elias had crawled through 2 collapsed corridors and 1 uncomfortably narrow maintenance shaft to find a functional language processor, and he had nearly electrocuted himself twice during the installation process. The things he did for conversation. The Kaeleth woman had watched his efforts with what he interpreted as bemused patience, though her alien features made emotional reading an uncertain art. Her condition had stabilized somewhat after he managed to remove the damaged armor section and apply a wound sealant from his emergency kit. The sealant was designed for human tissue, but it seemed to work well enough on her physiology, stopping the bleeding and allowing her to breathe without the wet rasp that had worried him earlier. She still could not move without pain, but the immediate danger of death had receded to a more manageable background threat. "All right," Elias said, connecting the final wire and powering on the cobbled-together translator. "Let's see if this actually works, or if I just wasted 3 hours of my rapidly shortening life." The device hummed, flickered, and produced a burst of static that made them both wince. Then it settled into a steady green glow that suggested functionality, or at least the appearance of functionality. Elias had learned long ago that machines were excellent liars when they wanted to be. He pointed at himself. "Elias. My name is Elias Crowe." The translator processed his words and emitted a series of sounds that bore no resemblance to human speech, all flowing vowels and clicking consonants that seemed to require a tongue more flexible than his own. The Kaeleth woman listened, her long ears tilting forward slightly, and then she spoke in response. "Alyndra Vesh," the translator rendered, the voice flat and mechanical but comprehensible. "I am called Alyndra Vesh." Elias felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. A name made her real in a way that her physical presence had not quite achieved. She was not just a wounded alien or an enemy combatant. She was Alyndra Vesh, and she had a voice he could finally understand. "Well, Alyndra Vesh," he said, testing the shape of her name in his mouth, "I have approximately 10,000 questions, but let's start with an easy one. How did you end up on a Terran warship with your own personal shrine, and enough time to get comfortable before everything exploded?" The translator worked through his words, and Alyndra's expression shifted into something that might have been dry amusement. When she responded, her voice was low and measured, and the translator caught most of it despite occasional gaps that left certain words as untranslated sounds. "I was brought here as a prisoner," she said. "Captured during a reconnaissance mission 14 cycles ago. Your people questioned me, learned nothing of value, and eventually forgot I existed. I was moved to this section of the ship when the holding cells were needed for others." "Forgot you existed," Elias repeated. "That sounds about right for Terran military efficiency. We can track a missile across 3 star systems, but we lose track of prisoners in our own brig. It's a gift, really." Alyndra made a sound that the translator did not render, but her expression suggested she understood his sarcasm, even if the words did not fully translate. Her amber eyes held his for a moment before she continued. "I was not unhappy to be forgotten. It allowed me to observe, to listen, to learn your language through the walls, and it allowed me to prepare for the moment when I might complete my mission." "Your mission," Elias said, leaning forward slightly. "You mentioned that before, when the translator was still broken. Something about a message you were supposed to deliver." Alyndra nodded, the gesture still strange on her alien features but familiar enough to read. She shifted her position against the support column, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounds, and when she spoke again her voice carried a weight that the mechanical translator could not fully convey. "I was sent to your admiral with a proposal from those among my people who believe this war is a mistake. We call ourselves the Vethalan, the Seekers of Dawn. We believe that what began between our species was a misunderstanding, a tragedy born from ignorance rather than malice, and we believe it can be ended through words rather than weapons." Elias sat back, processing this information. The war with the Kaeleth had seemed so simple from the perspective of a man who fixed engines and avoided thinking about politics. Humanity had expanded, the Kaeleth had resisted. Violence had followed violence until neither side remembered how to do anything else. The idea that it might have started as a misunderstanding felt both too simple and too terrible to accept. "What kind of misunderstanding?" he asked. Alyndra was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting to the shrine in the alcove. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, touched with something that might have been grief. "Your people found a moon in what you call the Kepler system, rich in minerals, uninhabited, perfect for extraction. Your miners landed, established operations, began to dig. They did not know that the moon was sacred to my people. They did not know that beneath the surface lay the resting place of our ancient dead, generations of Kaeleth who had been returned to the stars according to our oldest traditions." She looked back at Elias, and her amber eyes held a pain that transcended species. "When our patrol ships arrived, they found human machines tearing through the burial grounds of our ancestors. They saw desecration where your people saw only industry. They responded with weapons. Your people responded in kind. And so it began, each side convinced the other had struck first without cause." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. He thought about all the friends he had lost in the past 3 years, the ships that had vanished into the void, the memorial services conducted in cramped mess halls with recycled air and recycled grief. All of it because someone had not bothered to scan for cultural significance before firing up the mining drills. "That's it," he said, his voice rough. "A real estate dispute. 3 years of war because we accidentally dug up your cemetery." "Your words make it sound small," Alyndra said. "But to my people, the dead are not gone. They remain with us, their wisdom accessible through communion, their presence felt in the spaces they once occupied. What your miners did was not simply disturbing graves. It was silencing voices that had guided us for millennia. It was murder of those already dead. Elias wanted to argue, to point out that humanity had no way of knowing, that ignorance should count for something in the moral calculus of interstellar conflict. But the words died in his throat. Ignorance was not innocence. Not knowing did not undo the harm. The message you were supposed to deliver, he said instead. What was it? An offer of negotiation, coordinates for a neutral meeting place, names of Kaeleth leaders willing to speak rather than fight, evidence that the desecration was unintentional, gathered by our own investigators. Alyndra paused, and something like despair flickered across her features. But the Admiral is dead. I saw the reports on your communication channels before the power failed. He died in the first wave of the attack. The message has no recipient now. Elias thought about the chaos he had witnessed in the corridors, the scattered crew members running toward escape pods, the officers whose faces had been tight with fear rather than command. The chain of command had shattered along with the ship's hull. Even if Alyndra's message could end the war, there was no one left with the authority to receive it. There has to be someone else, he said. Another admiral, a diplomatic corps, someone who could take the proposal to people who matter. Alyndra leaned toward him then, close enough that he could smell the strange incense from her shrine mixed with the copper scent of her blood. Her eyes held his with an intensity that made his breath catch. Perhaps, she whispered, her voice dropping beneath the range the translator handled well. Perhaps there is someone. The shuttle bay was a graveyard of broken machines, but Elias had spent his entire adult life resurrecting the dead. He found a transport shuttle wedged between two destroyed fighters, its hull scorched but intact, its systems dark but not destroyed. While Alyndra rested against a cargo container, her strength slowly returning with each passing hour, he crawled beneath the shuttle and began the delicate work of bringing it back to life. 3 other survivors found them while he worked. Lieutenant Yara Chen arrived first, the same woman who owed him 40 credits, her uniform torn and her face streaked with dried blood from a cut above her eyebrow. She raised her sidearm when she saw Alyndra, and Elias had to talk fast to prevent the situation from becoming fatal. "She's not a threat," he said, sliding out from under the shuttle with his hands visible. "She's wounded, she's unarmed, and she might be our only chance of ending this war before it kills everyone we know." Chen kept her weapon raised. "She's Kaeleth. They just destroyed our ship and killed half our crew. And we destroyed their burial grounds and killed their ancestors. Turns out this whole war is a misunderstanding that got out of hand." Elias gestured toward the debris field visible through the force field. "Look out there, Lieutenant. Both sides lost today. Both sides have been losing for 3 years. Maybe it's time to try something different." Chen did not lower her weapon, but she did not fire either. That was enough for Elias to keep talking, explaining what Alyndra had told him, watching the lieutenant's expression shift from hostility to confusion, to something that might have been exhausted hope. By the time 2 more survivors arrived, an engineering ensign named Park and a medical officer named Okonkwo, Chen had holstered her sidearm and was helping Elias strip parts from the wrecked fighters. "This is insane," Park muttered as he handed Elias a replacement power coupling. "We're trusting an enemy soldier because she says she wants peace. For all we know, she's leading us into a trap." "For all we know, she's telling the truth," Elias replied, connecting the coupling with practiced efficiency. "I've spent 6 years fixing things that other people broke. Machines, systems, relationships between crew members who couldn't stand each other. You know what I've learned? Nothing stays broken unless you decide to leave it that way." Alyndra watched the exchange with her amber eyes, the translator rendering the conversation into sounds she could understand. When Park looked at her with undisguised suspicion, she met his gaze without flinching. "I could have killed your engineer when he first approached me," she said, her voice calm through the mechanical translation. "I was wounded, but not so wounded that I could not have taken one life before losing my own. I chose to trust him instead. Perhaps you could extend the same courtesy." Park had no response to that. He returned to his work in silence, and Elias allowed himself a small smile that he hid behind the shuttle's access panel. The shuttle systems came online one by one, each activation a small victory against the entropy that surrounded them. Elias felt the familiar satisfaction of repair, the sense of order restored to chaos. He had always found more meaning in fixing than in fighting. Perhaps that was why he had chosen to help Alyndra in the first place, seeing her not as an enemy but as something broken that might be made whole. Okonkwo examined Alyndra's wounds, while Elias finished the repairs, her medical scanner struggling with the alien biology but providing enough information to guide treatment. The two women communicated through gestures and the unreliable translator, finding common ground in the universal language of healing. By the time the shuttle was ready to fly, Alyndra could stand without assistance, though she still moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing significant pain. "Sensors are picking up activity at the edge of the debris field," Chen reported from the shuttle's cockpit. "Multiple signatures, both Terran and Kaeleth. They'll be in weapons range within the hour." Elias climbed into the pilot's seat, his hands moving across controls that were similar enough to the simulators he had trained on years ago. Flying had never been his specialty, but desperation was an excellent teacher. "Alyndra, you mentioned a neutral station. Where exactly are we going?" She moved to stand beside him, one hand bracing against the cockpit frame for support. "The coordinates are in my memory. I can guide you. It is a place called Threshold, a station built in the early years of First Contact, before the war. Representatives from both sides have met there in secret, trying to find a path back to peace. And they'll listen to us." Park asked from behind them, a handful of survivors with no authority and no proof. Alyndra reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a small crystalline object that pulsed with inner light. "I carry proof. The testimony of the Vethalan, recorded in a memory crystal that cannot be falsified, and I carry something more important than authority." She looked at Elias, and something passed between them that the translator could not capture. "I carry a story, a human who chose to heal an enemy instead of hate her, a crew that chose trust over fear. If that story can be told in the right ears, it may be worth more than all the authority in the galaxy." The shuttle lifted off, its engines straining against the debris that cluttered the hangar. Elias navigated through the wreckage with more skill than he knew he possessed, driven by the knowledge that failure meant death for all of them, and the continuation of a war that had already cost too much. They emerged from the Meridian's grace into the silent battlefield beyond, surrounded by the corpses of ships and the fading ghosts of everyone who had served aboard them. The debris field stretched in every direction, a monument to mutual destruction. Elias felt the weight of it pressing against his chest, all those lives reduced to floating metal and frozen atmosphere. "Incoming transmission," Chen said. "Terran frequency, they're demanding identification." "Ignore it," Elias replied. "We're not going back to the fleet, not yet." "Kaeleth frequency as well," Chen added, her voice tight. "They've spotted us. Both sides are tracking our trajectory." Elias pushed the throttle forward, coaxing more speed from the damaged engines. The shuttle shuddered but responded, accelerating toward the coordinates Alyndra provided. Behind them, the sensor display showed weapons powering up on ships from both factions. Neither side knew what the small shuttle carried. Neither side cared. In war, unknown variables were threats to be eliminated. "We're not going to make it," Park said, watching the tactical readout. "They're faster than we are." "Then we need to be smarter," Elias replied. He scanned the debris field ahead, looking for something he could use. His engineer's mind worked through possibilities, calculating trajectories and densities. "There, that cluster of wreckage, the remains of a Kaeleth cruiser. If I thread us through the gaps, the larger ships won't be able to follow." "That's suicide," Chen protested. The gaps are too narrow. Probably, Elias admitted. But everything else is definitely suicide, so I'll take probably over definitely any day. He plunged the shuttle into the wreckage, weaving between twisted bulkheads and shattered hull plates with reflexes he did not know he had. Alyndra stood beside him, calling out obstacles in her musical language, the translator abandoned in favor of pure instinct. They worked together without words, human and Kaeleth, pilot and navigator, two broken things finding wholeness in cooperation. The shuttle burst free of the debris field just as the pursuing ships fell back, unable to navigate the maze Elias had threaded. Ahead, space opened into clarity, and in the distance a station glittered like a jewel against the darkness. Threshold, the neutral ground where enemies might become something else. Elias let out a breath he had been holding for longer than he could remember. Beside him, Alyndra placed her hand on his shoulder, the touch warm and deliberate. "You asked me once what I whispered," she said, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "I told you that saving my life bound us together according to my people's traditions. But there is more. There is a prophecy among the Kaeleth, ancient words that speak of a time when the stars grow dark, and an outsider stands beside a daughter of our people to light them again." Elias looked at her, at the alien features that had become familiar, at the amber eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "I'm just an engineer," he said. "I fix broken things. I'm not prophecy material." Alyndra smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something beautiful and strange and utterly unfamiliar. Perhaps prophecy is simply another word for choosing to repair what others have broken. Perhaps it has always been engineers who light the stars. The shuttle sailed toward Threshold, carrying its cargo of hope and uncertainty. Behind them, the war continued. Ahead of them, something new waited to be built.